Hey, good morning. This is Oscar with Global Banker Residential Property Management. And this morning I want to talk to you about something that the Texas Real Estate Commission, a form, has put out. It's Form 51-1 called Addendum Regarding Residential Leases. This is a form that came out a couple of years ago, and it is required to use if you are selling a property that has a tenant in there when you go under contract. This is a really important form because it answers a lot of questions and it helps your buyers or your sellers have a clear understanding of what's happening to the property once it goes under contract. Okay, so for the first paragraph of this addendum is paragraph A, termination of residential leases. This just simply means that at the time of closing, there will not be an active lease in place. The tenants will have already moved out. So remember, if you go under contract on the property and there is still a tenant in the property when you went under contract, this form needs to be written. Buyers, if you don't want to have to mess with security deposit return, walking a property, or even honoring any terms of the lease, this is what you want to make sure is being selected. Sellers, when you are selecting this option to say that you're going to have the tenant out of the property by the time of closing, there are a few things that you need to take into consideration. When the tenant moves out, you still have to enforce the lease, meaning security deposit responsibility. That is still something that you are required to have to account for to the tenant. Also, if there's any kind of damages, any kind of repairs, cleaning, what is the arrangement that you're going to have with that buyer? So we normally recommend that you have the property vacated a couple of weeks prior to closing, and you should know this when you go under contract or when you're in the initial terms of the option periods. And that way, you've got a couple of weeks to walk through the property and just get taken care of with what you need to do. Okay, paragraph B. This is an important paragraph. This talks about if you are going to be keeping a tenant in the property, after closing. So that whether it's a day or whether it's 12 months, this is the selection that you choose when you're purchasing the property, primarily if you're buying it as an investment property. Even if you're an owner-occupied buyer who's purchasing the property and you're just finishing out the lease of the tenant, this needs to be checked. It's very important that you understand this first sentence: assignment and assumption of residential leases. Existing residential leases shall be assigned by seller and assumed by buyer at closing. This means that a buyer, you have to honor the terms of the lease that you are receiving. Just because you don't want the tenant in the property or you don't like the terms, you can't just change it without the tenant's permission. So this is really important. This also is going to tell you that you have to get a copy of the lease when you go under contract. There are a lot of property management companies out there, and I've come across property managers that will say, we can't give you a copy of their lease because there are privacy issues, and that is just simply not the case. If you are a buyer purchasing a property, you have the right to see the terms of that lease to make sure that they are in fact what they were advertised for, what you're purchasing that property for. And so you should be doing this. You should be doing lease audits if you're purchasing the property for investment properties. But this is talking about that the buyer has received a copy of the residential leases. And so at the time you go under contract, this addendum is saying, yeah, we've received them. If you haven't, then you're going to select this subsection B. Buyer has not received a copy of the residential leases. And then you've got 3 days, or the buyer may terminate within blank days after the date the buyer receives the leases, and the earnest money shall be refunded. This is a really important thing. So after you ask for those leases, if in turn the leases aren't what were advertised, or you just don't like a specific clause of the lease, you can still terminate the contract. And this is going to even be after your option period. Ideally, if you can get all this stuff done within your option period, the termination, the unrestricted rights to terminate the option period will sort of cover everything anyways. This also talks about that if you have any kind of an oral lease or any kind of a verbal agreement, this happens a lot when maybe you're purchasing a property and somebody's brother is living in the property and, hey, this is what we've agreed to. Try not to assume any type of verbal leases. Just make sure that you're getting it in writing to some extent. This form is actually doing that for you. So it's just saying that these are the tenants, the rent amount, and the term, and so you're kind of getting it in writing, but it's not in writing between you and the tenant. You just are acknowledging that you understand the terms of those leases. Okay, so we're still under paragraph B, and this is subsection 2, talking about security deposits. It's just simply stating that at the time of closing, the seller is going to be transferring over security deposits over to the buyer, and now the buyer is responsible for being responsible for the return of the security deposit to the buyer. To the tenant. As a buyer, when you're getting this, you need to understand, are you actually getting a security deposit? Here recently, there has been a rise in what's called security deposit alternatives, and effectively what this is a bond. So in lieu of an actual traditional cash deposit, property management companies or owners may be taking a bond from a company like Jetty or Rhino or Obligo, where what this does is this actually replaces the security deposit, and it will cover the owner in the event there's any kind of damage, similar to what a security deposit does. However, the tenants pay a monthly fee to the company directly, usually as the owner. If you don't have to worry about it right away, depending on the company that you're getting. Like if it's Rhino, these bond policies have to be renewed every year. If it's a Jetty policy, once they've made one payment or once they've paid for that bond, it's there through the life of the lease. Other companies may have different rules, so it's really, really important that as a buyer, you're understanding what is the nature of the security deposit that you're getting. Is it a traditional deposit? Is it a security deposit alternative? This is also going to go for pet deposits. Other things that you need to be aware of are that management companies may charge pet fees. What the difference between a fee and a deposit is a fee is not returned to the buyer or to the tenant. So if you are a buyer who's purchasing a property and there is a pet on the property, do not assume that it is a pet deposit where it's going back to you. That may be a pet fee that the seller is actually keeping, and you're not entitled to those funds. And so when you're looking at the terms of the lease, and usually if you're using a TAR form or even an apartment lease, it will very specifically say that if there's any kind of a fee or deposit that is being charged for that pet, it will identify whether or not it is a deposit or a fee. You need to get past the terminology of a non-refundable security deposit. Those things don't exist. The very definition of a deposit is that you actually are entitled to get that money back. But if they have categorized it as a fee, as a buyer, you're not entitled to that because that is revenue that's going into that owner. So just make sure that you understand that. And then at the time of closing, that security deposit is going to be transferred over to you. So you need to be looking on your settlement statement. Is it actually being issued to you as a credit? If you're buying it with a bank loan or if you're getting a cash transaction, a lot of times the title company will just give you a credit at closing. But if you're getting a mortgage, if you're doing a non-owner occupied type loan where you're putting a 30-year mortgage on the property, the lender may not allow that credit to come over. So what may have to happen is that security deposit may have to happen outside of closing. Just make sure that you understand how those deposits are being handled at the time of closing. Subsection 3, this is giving you a little bit more details of the actual lease and what the situation with the lease and the tenant is. The very first section is saying that the residential lease is in full force and effect, which means that when you purchase the property, you still have to honor the terms of that lease. It also talks about that the tenant is not in default or in violation of the residential lease. This is really important to talk about default or what kind of default the tenant may be in. Most of the time, evictions are happening because of non-payment of rent. And as a buyer, you need to be thinking about that and how that actually affects you. You are not entitled to any revenue prior to the date of closing. So if a tenant is being evicted for non-payment of rent, they're being evicted because they owe that money to the previous landlord. What is the landlord going to be doing with that eviction process? Are they still moving forward with it? Are they going to be handling it? Are they dropping the suit after everything is said and done because now you have to deal with it? Are you expected to have to deal with that eviction? If it's something that you don't want to deal with and you want it to be cleared up and you just want you agree that, hey, I don't want that tenant in there. If they're not paying you, they're not going to pay me. So let's just go ahead and get them out. But you don't want to have to deal with it, or you don't have a management company to help you out. You may just want to go ahead and check Section A on the first part of this saying that, hey, at the time of closing, the tenant's going to be out. And so this will automatically extend out. So that way it'll give, you'll see in the next section, it'll give the seller time to be able to make that happen. However, if you are going to be taking it over, now you need to contemplate with that new tenant, are you really going to make them pay the back rent to you? Number one, you're not entitled to it. And maybe this may be the little break that they need. Maybe let the seller deal with that, like any past amounts that are owed to them, but they're going to be starting off clean with you. Now, if it's a violation like let's say that they have pets, or they have an unauthorized tenant, or they're actually doing something and it's not necessarily doesn't have anything to do with the actual payment of rent, but maybe more of a lease violation, this is something that you're going to have to deal with. And so if the previous owner has already started the eviction process saying because of an unauthorized pet, and now you're taking over, how are you going to handle that? This also talks about any kind of prepayment of rent. Sometimes tenants will pay months in advance. That amount of money needs to be transferred over to you at closing, because that tenant has paid rent and has honored the terms of the lease that it has just gone to the previous owner. That amount of money needs to come over to you, so these questions need to be asked prior to you going into contract on the property. If the title is entitled to any kind of offset against rent, so this usually will happen if a landlord has given some type of a move-in credit or a move-in special, or just any type of credit in general where they've agreed to in writing, or maybe even verbally, that hey, on month 3 I'm going to give you a $200 rent credit. Us as a management company, what we're doing right now on pre-leasing is we're offering a $100 credit to tenants who go ahead and renew their leases early, but we're doing it on the renewal month. So if you were to sell a property right now and the renewal month was in July, we would be disclosing like, hey, this tenant has a $100 credit effective July 1. As a buyer, you need to be aware, are there any kind of credits or any kind of arrangements that have happened prior to you purchasing the property? Again, this may affect the profitability of the property. You also want to make sure that there are no outstanding tenant claims against the seller moving against the property, meaning that let's say that there's a repair that needed to happen, or there's a security deposit dispute where they're arguing about the security deposit, where maybe the previous owner already took out on $1,000 deposit, took $500 out of the repair, and the tenant is disputing this. They're saying, no, this is not, you shouldn't be taking it from my security deposit, you're responsible for this cost. And so any kind of conflict or dispute that may be going on with that seller, you need to be made aware of it. This is a very rare thing that happens, and it usually gets resolved very quickly, but it is a question that you need to be asking. You also need to see if there's any other arrangements, options, or rights outside the lease between the landlord and the tenant regarding the property. This usually happens when you had a tenant that's been in the property for a really long time, and maybe 5 years ago they signed a lease where they said no dogs, but now all of a sudden they've got a pet, and the owner has been really good about it. They know that the pet's not causing any damage, and they just sort of have allowed it, but it's not being put in writing anywhere. These are things that you need to be aware of. So again, that's why it's really important that you get a copy of that lease as quickly as possible, so that way you can review it. So then that way when you start getting into some weird terms like this, what they're disclosing, Okay, the last part of this addendum, subsection 4. This is basically saying that if any terms or anything while you're under contract changes, meaning that all of a sudden the tenant hasn't paid their rent, and now you're starting the eviction process as an owner, the buyer needs to be made aware of this, and they need to understand that, hey, some terms have changed. You've allowed the tenants to bring a pet on the property. There has been a rent change. Let's say that for whatever reason the tenant's going to want to terminate the lease, or something has happened because of a repair, and you decide that maybe to keep the tenant in there that you decide to reduce rent or making a repair. This is basically saying that if there's anything that changes within the terms of the lease, or something that makes the above statements untrue after you've gone under contract, that you're going to work hard to get these things resolved. So the minute something changes, you need to notify the buyer of what's happening. The buyer will have 5 days to figure out whether or not it's a big deal for them and they want to terminate the contract, or not. They just go ahead and move forward. And this contract is saying that if the buyer doesn't do anything and they just don't terminate the contract, that on the morning of the 6th, they're going through and they've waived their right to be able to terminate the contract because a term of the lease has changed. And so this is just a good paragraph to have to make sure that you're staying in communication with your property management company, knowing with what's going on. Again, sometimes maybe tenants will just vacate the property. They may skip. And if the buyer is purchasing this property because there's a tenant in the property, now there's no longer a tenant in the property, but you didn't do anything wrong, the tenant just left. The buyer needs to be made aware of that, which means that you need to have good communication with your management company while you're under contract on this property.